Afsaneh, this is not new to you, the idea that we're going to take into account climate issues when we invest.
Climate issues have been around for those of us who've been thinking about it since about 30, 40 years ago. And I think the term ESG and the term sort of impact and looking at climate as part of your economic decision making has been around, particularly in countries that are growing very fast and using energy very fast.
Well, and you came from Iran, which is dependent upon oil at the time.
Absolutely.
You studied energy, basically. You were a banker in energy, so in the developing world. So you know this area terribly well.
We were working on renewable energy at the World Bank in the 1990s. And I remember going to Shell, and they closed down the renewable area because there was really, the economics was not good, nobody was adopting it. And it's really, really exciting to see where we are now with the price of solar being so competitive with all the other, with hydrocarbons.
Exactly. I mean, you know, there's been a lot of progress. I think to me an indication of a huge shift is that the CEOs of the major oil companies, the integrated oil companies, all signed the Paris Accord and supported the Paris Accord to President Trump when he was talking about withdrawal, right? This is having been involved with this industry for a long time, this is a dramatic shift, I'd say, from 10 years ago. If you would have expected the leaders of those major integrated oil companies to go support a climate initiative, even though the science is somewhat not completely defined, and these guys are mostly geophysicists, I mean, they'd argue the science, but fundamentally that they got behind it, I think is a major shift.
But Sam, as a CEO, how do you trade off the long term from the shorter term? Because as a practical matter, you may have to give up some profitability in the short term for the longer term health of the company.
It depends. See, this is where, I can get through a long discussion of this because in my little think tank, we did a study about activism in investing, and we have a database of 51,000 engagements. But the reason why I say it depends is because if you view ESG as your brand, this is the brand, right? Then it's different than you view it as an initiative because you think the timing could be good. But if you live by that as your value system, and I'll give you a quick example, and I don't want to spend too much time on IBM, we launched this thing called Smarter Planet. Smarter Planet addressed climate emissions in Stockholm and cities like that because of traffic.
And that was a long time ago.
We launched it in 2008.
Long before this was fashionable.
But well before that, right? And it had to do with climate, it had to do with cleaning up Galway Bay, the Hudson River with the spills, all these sorts of things. Those projects were every bit as economically attractive to our returns as other things we were doing. And so now, I mean, you could say, well, you're a technology company, you can use software and all that, which we could, you know, but nonetheless, we picked it, I would say, because we felt that there was an emerging need for smarter cities, smarter environment. And oh, by the way, our workforce, hiring, the applications at IBM after we launched quadrupled in like 90 days.
But Afsaneh, this is climate. This is the environment in the ESG, the E in ESG. Social and governance, do they drive results as much as a practical matter?
So I think on the environment side and on energy, it's now proven, I think, that cleaner sources of energy do compete in the short run and in the long run. When it comes to social and governance, governance has been around for a long time.
Yes.
Sam, in fact, was leading the charge for a long, long time. And you remember the days when Nell Milo and Mr. Monks, you know, started ISS. So the use of governance, again, has been around for a long time. I think what is changing now is companies are actually really adopting it. Those who didn't care about risk management got into trouble. So now it's a very important part of governance.
I mean, I think that, and there are very good reasons for it. But governance is complicated, as our colleague knows, because some people use governance for the right purpose, as responsibility, transparency of earnings and behavior, whatever it happens to be. Other people will use it from an activism investor perspective to get control over boards to push their agenda. And their agenda is not necessarily in sync with the long-term strategy of the company. So I would argue in some cases they've actually used these proxy surrogates to advance their agenda and the regulators to get more of this as far as board turnover and separate incentives for boards and those sorts of things to drive their own personal agendas. So it's, yes, at the highest level, everybody wants great governance. You don't want another Enron or any of those sorts of things. However, it's also being, I would argue, misused by certain parties in the market.
Well, to that point, Afsaneh, if you don't have some standardized ways of measuring, E, S, or G, then it becomes sort of a marketing tool. You say, yo, we believe in this.
Yes.
But how are we going to get to a world where actually we are all reporting the same way so we can measure?
It is difficult to measure every industry and every sector and every strategy with the same metrics. So there are lots and lots of different groups that have emerged, including like SASB, who's trying to sort of create a structure for this.
Right.
So I think it will be difficult to put one set of metrics for everything, but to have reasonable metrics, again, going back to climate, because you can measure carbon relatively easily, that's more straightforward. What you talked about, social, much harder to measure if inequality has increased or reduced and how, over what kind of period. But how has that impacted, let's say, just something like well-being? Are people more productive in their jobs or less productive? Those take a long time, and you've lived that, and you've had to practice it.
I think as long as you do it for the right reasons and take for, say, social or inclusion. I mean, if your goal is have the best talent pool in the world, you're inclusive.
Right.
Because you want the best. I don't care. I used to say, I don't care what they are. I don't care what you are. I don't care what your beliefs, your religion, your gender. I want the best I can get, and I'm going to reward you equally. And this is how the place is going to work. So I think it's a talent attraction. So we never did it in IBM because we thought the government was going to audit us, so we had to measure it. We did it because we wanted the best talent we could find, wherever we could find it.
But how can we have a discussion about governance with a straight face this week when you saw what went on with Boeing, and for that matter, Nissan as well, what's going on with Nissan Renault?
See, I think it's culture. I mean, I believe that those issues are driven as much by culture, which then causes the governance incident. And by that I mean, I only know what I've read in the paper, so I don't have any inside information. But I would surmise, having been in those jobs, that those leaders at that point in time were overreaching for whatever set of purposes, pushing schedules, lower costs, what have you, except you have a product you're developing that people could die, or pushing very hard for revenue, and at the same time correlating to a high compensation package. So you overreached for personal gain. If you do that, you're going to have governance issues. It's a cultural problem. It's not you can't govern bad behavior. You should have integrity in executives who believe in a value system.
It's a great theory, but as you're investing, Afsaneh, how do you know what's going on inside the boardroom?
You do your best. You try to talk to as many people as you can. You talk to as many people who are different kinds of stakeholders in a company, right? So it's not, you have to not just talk to people on the board or, their CEO, but you try to talk to their senior team, talk to others. If there have been safety issues, if there have been spills, if it's an oil company, if it's, the same thing you were just talking about, Sam, also happened in the banks. Do you remember those tapes that came out from some banks on trading and on derivatives and things like that?
Right.
So it's exactly the same thing. It's just the question of values and culture.
But Sam, there's also another issue. Go to the tapes on the banks.
Right.
Any big organization has some bad apples in it.
Correct.
The question is it from the top, or is it just some people that are off the reservation?
This is my belief, right, having done this before. When I took over at IBM, we created a whole different value system. The employees created it. I won't bore you with all the details. But that was principles that 400,000 people in 170 countries could all live by, regardless of background, gender, religion, whatever it happened to be, culture, right? That was the core integration point. Then you would enforce those values. If you violated those values, whatever they happened to be, if you did those tapes, or if you were your behavior was poor with a different gender employee, you were gone. Yeah. There was no big process. Everybody knew you were gone. Right. Guess what? We didn't have much because they understood. I mean, if you did something aggressive in China or Russia, I didn't care how big you were. Or as a business partner, you were no longer our partner. And then once you do this a couple times, the whole
humans do respond to incentives.
They get it.
Positive and negative.
Right.